Blow ye the trumpet in Zion, sound an alarm in my holy mountain. Thank you for joining me for the Trumpet of Truth podcast. My name is Brother Greg Bray. I'm the pastor of Lighthouse Baptist Church in Bruce, Mississippi. Thank you for listening to my podcast. I've never done anything like this before. Preach, yes, but not podcast, where I had to have something kind of organized. I've had several thoughts about the content for this podcast, and I'll say this to begin with, even though the content may not all be the same all the time to begin with, I believe will have structure as I go on with the podcast in days to come. I thought about talking about the history of hymns. I really enjoy songs. I started out leading the singing at the church I grew up in, Calvary Baptist Church in Bruce. And I started out, matter of fact, my pastor put me up when I was 7 years old, and I've always loved hymns. And then I went on as a teenager to be the full-time music director, song leader, we called it. You know, different people called it different things. Now it's called a worship leader. I disagree with that term because I believe the pastor is the worship leader. So I thought about the history of hymns. It carries me back to when I was in college at Blue Mountain College, Blue Mountain, Mississippi. My music teacher had a book. It was actually like a hymnal, and he would ask the people to turn to certain hymn, and then he would give a history of that hymn, and then he would lead them in that hymn, or he would lead us in that hymn. So I really enjoyed that. It carried me back to that, and I thought about that. I also thought about testimonies, people giving testimony of when they were saved, and I love to hear people's testimonies. Blesses my heart. So I kind of thought about that. Of course, if I do that, it'll require interviews with the people that's giving the testimony, or maybe even possibly ask them to give a short, maybe 10-minute, 15-minute testimony and record it and send it to me or something, and then I air that testimony on my podcast and talk a little bit about it. I thought about missions. I've known a lot of missionaries in the time that I've pastored, or even through my life. I could give testimony about some of the missionaries that I experienced in growing up in church. I thought about even talking about church and what church really means. Church, I've been in church all my life. As a matter of fact, whenever I was born, we lived in the parsonage. My mom and daddy lived in the parsonage of Calvary Baptist Church, and we were just right across the yard from the church. And I don't remember until I was an older child, of course, church, but my first memories of church was when I was real young. I thought about doing some interviews with preachers and about their churches, about maybe evangelists, about their evangelism. So I thought about several things, just several thoughts for content for this podcast. I will say this is an introduction to my podcast, Trumpet of Truth. Several years ago, myself and 3 other preachers, maybe 4 other preachers at one time. We had a TV program on a local television station here in Bruce, and it was called Trumpet of Truth. And I was trying to think, as I was trying to think about what to do with this podcast, I thought about Trumpet of Truth. And Joel chapter 2 and verse number 1, my intro to the podcast, I quote a portion of this verse where Joel said, I recorded what the Lord said when he said, "Blow ye the trumpet in Zion, sound an alarm in my holy mountain." So I believe everything that I do on this podcast will be something that will sound an alarm. It'll be blowing the trumpet. It'll be something that will teach people what it's about to be God's children, God's preachers, and everything about the church. And that's what I want to do with this podcast. So I'd ask if you listen to this to be much in prayer about the podcast and what we would do on this podcast. And there'll be a way that, of course, as I move along, you'll be able to listen to the podcast not only on Spotify, but on Apple Podcast, on Google Podcast, and on some others that I'll mention at another time that you can listen on as they're added to my feed on this app that I use to do the podcast. So I thank you for tuning in, and I'll have a lot more to say later, and hopefully a lot of content that will interest all of you. And thank you so much. And again, be much in prayer. My email address is BroGregBray, BroGregbray @gmail.com. So if you'd like to, you could leave me a message by email, comment on some things that maybe that we've talked about, or maybe comment on some things that you would like to hear in the podcast as we get going. Give me time, and I'll give you some interesting things. Thank you for joining me today, and praise the Lord. He gives us the things that we need at the right time.